My name is Maya Carter, and I'm 32, and I found out my stepmother tried to erase me from my father's will while I was sitting 10 feet away from her in a freezing attorney's office. The table was polished oak. The air smelled like stale coffee. Sloane stood up in her designer black dress, smiled like she was doing me a favor, and slid a single sheet across the table. "Before we start," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you should know Graham removed you. Entirely." Her sister gasped. One of her cousins actually nodded, like I deserved it. My throat locked. Then my dad's lawyer picked up the paper and started laughing. "Before I go on, tell me where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever felt like the forgotten one in your own family. The child who stayed quiet, did the right thing, and still got blamed when money and inheritance were on the line." I read the comments, and you'd be shocked how many families hide betrayal behind paperwork. If this already feels familiar, stay with me. Before Sloane ever stepped into our lives, my father was my safest place in the world. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every driveway looked the same, and every mailbox had a family name printed in neat black letters. On Sundays, Dad woke me up early so we could mow the lawn together. He always handed me the lighter mower and said, "Teamwork," like it was a rule he lived by. The smell of fresh-cut grass still takes me straight back to those mornings. Sun barely up, sprinklers ticking in the distance. Dad in an old Carter Development Group t-shirt with paint stains that never quite washed out. He built everything we had with his hands. Before the company, before the nice cars and business dinners, he was a guy fixing up a half-collapsed house in a rough part of town, working nights and weekends because he believed homes mattered. Not just as investments, but as places where people felt safe. That belief carried into how he raised me. When I was 12, he taught me how to change a tire in the garage. My hands were greasy, my arms too weak to loosen the bolts, and I remember feeling stupid. He didn't rush me. He just leaned against the workbench and said, "You don't quit because it's hard. You slow down." That sentence shaped more of my life than he ever knew. My mum, Evelyn, was the warmth in our house. She was a high school art teacher who filled every empty wall with colour, paintings, charcoal sketches, half-finished canvases. Our kitchen was always alive, music playing while she cooked, Dad pretending to complain while stealing bites. Taco Tuesdays, friends stopping by without calling first, laughter that spilled into the backyard during summer barbecues. We were family people who liked being around. When I was 17, all of that disappeared in 6 months. Breast cancer doesn't announce itself gently. It moved fast, brutal, and unfair. One minute, Mom was lecturing me about college applications. The next, she was too weak to walk from the bedroom to the couch. Our house changed smells: bleach, antiseptic, hospital plastic. The art stopped going up on the walls. The music stopped playing. The night she died, I didn't go into the bedroom. I sat on the floor outside the door, knees pulled to my chest, listening to my father cry. I had never heard him make that sound before. It wasn't loud. It was worse than that. Broken, quiet, like he didn't want the world to know how badly he was falling apart. After the funeral, Dad tried to hold us together. He still made breakfast, still asked about school, but the colour was gone. We were surviving, not living. I told myself we were okay because we had each other, and for a while, that was true. Then Sloane appeared. Dad met her at a charity gala, the kind he felt obligated to attend once the company grew. She was breathtaking in a way that felt intentional. Long, dark hair, perfect posture, a smile that made people lean in. She worked events for the charity and knew exactly how to talk to donors. When Dad brought her home for dinner, she showed up with an expensive bracelet for me and compliments for everything. She asked about my mum's paintings like she genuinely cared. I wanted to believe her. Dad smiled again around her, not fully, but enough that I told myself this was a good thing. He deserved happiness. He deserved someone after everything he'd been through. When he announced they were getting married after 4 months, my stomach dropped, but I swallowed it. I was leaving for college soon. The thought of him alone in that big house scared me more than my doubts about her. The wedding was small, but lavish. I stood beside him as his best woman, forcing a smile while Sloane walked down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than my first year of tuition. I remember thinking it felt too fast, too polished, like something was being rushed before it could be questioned. I didn't know then that speed was part of the strategy. The changes started quietly after the honeymoon. One painting disappeared from the hallway, then another. When I asked, Sloane smiled and said, "Your father and I want a fresh start." Dad nodded, distracted, already buried in work as the company expanded into commercial properties. Sunday dinners changed. Dad's old friends stopped coming around. In their place were business associates and donors. Sloane ran the table like a performance. Perfect meals, perfect outfits, perfect timing. I sat there feeling underdressed, out of place, like a guest in my own home. By the time I left for college, she was in full control. When I came home for Thanksgiving, my childhood bedroom was gone, converted into a meditation room, white walls, candles. Nothing that looked like me had ever lived there. I slept in the guest room, staring at unfamiliar furniture, telling myself not to be dramatic. I didn't realize it then, but that room was the first thing she erased, and it wouldn't be the last. After I left for college, distance became Sloane's most effective weapon. At first, it was subtle. She forgot to tell me about family dinners until the day of, or she'd mention them casually, after the fact, in a way that made it sound like I had chosen not to come. "Your dad was so disappointed you couldn't make it," she'd say, tilting her head with that same careful smile. I'd feel the familiar pinch of guilt and promise myself I'd try harder next time. I did try. I called Dad whenever I could between classes and part-time shifts. Sometimes the phone rang until voicemail. Other times, Sloane answered and told me he was busy, in a meeting, or resting. "He'll call you back," she'd say. He rarely did. I told myself he was exhausted, overwhelmed, still grieving. I didn't want to be another demand for him. When I went home during breaks, the house felt colder, not just emotionally, physically. The lights were dimmer, the furniture had changed. Photos of my mum slowly disappeared, replaced by framed pictures of Sloane and Dad at galas and charity events. Every time I noticed one missing, it felt like a small betrayal I couldn't quite name. Sloane became an expert at planting doubts without ever saying anything outright. She'd comment on my clothes, my career plans, my lack of a serious relationship, always wrapped in concern. "You travel so much," she'd say. "It must be hard for your father to keep up with your life." Or worse, "Some parents just get used to their kids growing apart." Dad defended me sometimes, but it was weak, avoidant. "She means well," he'd say when we were alone. "She just worries." I could see the tension in his jaw when he said it, the way he changed the subject like he was stepping around a landmine. As the years passed, the distance hardened into something heavier. He missed my college graduation because Sloane planned a surprise anniversary trip. He forgot my birthday 3 years in a row, then sent expensive gifts that felt impersonal, like they'd been chosen by an assistant who skimmed my social media. Our phone calls shrank to 10 rushed minutes. He always seemed distracted, glancing at something off-screen, lowering his voice. The man who once knew every detail of my life now barely knew where I was living. When I was 28, I took a senior role with an international marketing firm. The travel was constant: Seattle, London, Tokyo. In some ways, it was a relief. Fewer visits home meant fewer awkward dinners, fewer passive comments from Sloane about how independent I'd become. But when I did come back for the holidays, she paraded me in front of guests as proof of her generosity. "We're so close," she'd say, arm locked around my shoulders, nails digging in just enough to warn me not to contradict her. "Maya is like the daughter I never had." People smiled. I smiled back. Inside, something burned. I told myself this was normal. Adult children drift. Parents build new lives. I tried to make peace with the idea that my relationship with Dad had simply changed. Still, late at night, guilt crept in. Maybe I hadn't called enough. Maybe I should have fought harder to stay close. I didn't know that someone was making sure my calls never reached him. The first time I sensed something was truly wrong was a Thanksgiving I almost didn't attend. Sloane called 2 days before and said, "We assumed you were working, so we made other plans." When I showed up anyway, Dad looked genuinely surprised and relieved. "I thought you weren't coming," he said quietly, like he was afraid to sound hopeful. That moment stayed with me. After dinner, I found an unopened envelope in the junk drawer by the kitchen phone. It had my handwriting on it. A birthday card I'd mailed weeks earlier, still sealed. When I asked Sloane about it, she shrugged. "Oh, mail gets lost around here all the time." Dad wasn't in the room when she said it. I should have pushed harder then. I should have asked more questions. But I didn't. I was tired of being the difficult one, tired of feeling like I was imagining problems that no one else seemed to see. So I swallowed it. Again. Over time, Dad stopped asking about my work. I stopped asking when I was coming home. He sounded resigned on the phone, like he'd already accepted that I had moved on without him. The distance between us became something solid, something I could feel in my chest every time we hung up. I didn't know that Sloane had been intercepting messages, deleting voicemails, rewriting our story one omission at a time. I only knew that I was losing my father while he was still alive, and I couldn't understand why. By the time I got that call at 3 a.m. telling me he was gone, I believed the worst thing had already happened, that we had simply drifted apart, that I had failed him when he needed me most. What I didn't know yet was that none of that distance had been accidental, and that the truth was waiting for me, hidden in paperwork, silence, and a woman who had spent years making sure we never spoke at the same time. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a venue. That was the first thought that hit me when I walked through the front door after flying in for my father's funeral. The entryway was filled with towering floral arrangements, white lilies and roses packed so tightly they looked suffocating. There were catering trays lining the kitchen counter, stacks of wine glasses, staff moving quietly like this was a planned event, instead of the aftermath of a death. Sloane stood in the living room giving instructions, dressed in black so tailored it looked rehearsed. When she saw me, she leaned in for an air kiss, barely brushing my cheek. "Maya, you must be exhausted," she said softly. "That kind of travel is brutal." No hug. No, "I'm so sorry." No acknowledgement that I had just lost my father. She pointed toward the stairs. "I had the guest room prepared for you. The funeral is tomorrow at 11. I've handled everything." Handled. That word sat heavy in my chest. I went upstairs and closed the guest room door behind me, sitting on the edge of the unfamiliar bed. The room smelled like hotel soap and clean sheets. Nothing about it felt like the house I grew up in. I stared at my phone, half expecting a message from Dad explaining everything, apologizing for the distance, telling me I wasn't too late. The silence was absolute. The funeral felt wrong from the moment it started. Sloane chose a massive church Dad had never attended. The music was a string quartet playing songs I had never heard him mention once. The guest list was packed with business associates, donors, people who knew my father as a brand, not a man. I sat in the front row beside Sloane, my hands folded in my lap, feeling like an accessory. When she stood to speak, her grief was flawless. Tears at the right moments. Stories about their perfect partnership. She talked about how she had made his final years joyful and fulfilling. She never said my name. When it was my turn, my voice shook. I spoke about the dad who taught me how to change a tire, who stayed up late helping me with school projects, who believed homes should feel safe. I talked about the man he was before anyone knew his company's name. I could feel Sloane's eyes on me the entire time, sharp and assessing. After the service, the house filled with people again. Condolences, stories, forced smiles. I found comfort talking to Ray and a few old family friends who remembered my mum, who remembered when Dad laughed easily. Every time someone hugged me a little too long, I noticed Sloane watching from across the room, her smile tightening. When the last guest finally left and the house went quiet, I asked her for something small. "Could I keep Dad's watch?" I said. "Or his fishing tackle, the one we used at the lake?" She didn't hesitate. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." I blinked. "What?" "I've already taken care of his personal effects," she said calmly. "The watch is being appraised. The fishing equipment was donated. It was cluttered. Clutter. Those things weren't objects, they were memories. Proof that my father had existed outside of boardrooms and balance sheets. "You had no right," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. Sloane's expression shifted, just for a second. The mask slipped. "I had every right," she snapped. "I was his wife. I was here when you weren't." Her words landed exactly where she meant them to. In my guilt. In my fear that maybe I had abandoned him after all. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, as I stood in the kitchen staring at a cup of coffee gone cold, Marisol approached me quietly. She glanced toward the hallway before speaking. "I shouldn't say this," she whispered, "but Mrs. Carter deletes messages, calls too. She's done it for years. I was scared to tell your father." My hands tightened around the mug. "Are you sure?" I asked. She nodded. "I saw her. More than once." Before I could ask anything else, Sloane appeared in the doorway. Marisol fell silent and hurried away. I didn't confront Sloane. Not yet. I needed facts, not a fight I couldn't win. I moved to a hotel that night, telling Sloane I needed space. She didn't argue. Instead, she started calling me every day. "I just want to prepare you," she'd say sweetly. "Your father left everything to me. He was deeply hurt by how distant you became. I think he wanted to make a statement." Each call felt like a slow poison, designed to weaken me before the will reading. 2 days before the meeting with Miles Bennett, I returned to the house to pick up some clothes. As I walked past the old desk near the kitchen phone, something caught my eye. An envelope, still sealed, tucked behind a stack of papers. My name was written on it, in my handwriting, a birthday card I'd mailed weeks before Dad died, unopened. My chest tightened as pieces started to shift into place. Missed calls, short conversations. The way Dad had sounded resigned, almost apologetic, like he believed I had chosen distance. I slid the card back where I found it before anyone could see me holding it. That was the moment I stopped blaming myself. On the morning of the will reading, I arrived early at Miles Bennett's office, hoping to speak with him privately. The receptionist smiled politely and told me he was in another meeting. I took a seat in the waiting room, smoothing my black dress, rehearsing calm in my head. Sloane arrived exactly on time, with her sister and 2 relatives I barely recognized. She smiled when she saw me, a thin, confident curve of her lips. "Maya," she said loudly, "I was just telling my family how brave you are for coming today. Some people wouldn't have the courage after everything." Her relatives nodded, eyes full of judgment. I said nothing, because whatever Sloane thought she had planned for that room, I was done being blindsided. And she was about to find out that silence doesn't always mean weakness. The waiting room felt deliberately uncomfortable. The chairs were stiff leather, arranged in a neat row, like they were meant to keep people from relaxing. A muted television murmured in the corner, some midday news segment no one was watching. Every few seconds, the receptionist's keyboard clicked, sharp and intrusive in the silence. Sloane took the seat closest to the conference room door. Her sister sat beside her, legs crossed, whispering occasionally. The 2 relatives hovered nearby, pretending to scroll on their phones while clearly listening to everything. I sat alone on the opposite side. No one offered me a greeting. No one asked how I was holding up. I had the distinct feeling that this had already been decided without me. Sloane broke the silence first. "You know," she said casually, loud enough for the room to hear, "Graham used to worry about you, about how little time you made for your family once your career took off." Her sister nodded sympathetically. "That must have been hard for him." I kept my eyes on the carpet. Grey, low pile, clean, neutral. If I looked up, I might explode. "He understood, of course," Sloane continued, "but it still hurt him, especially near the end." She sighed, performing concern. "Some people show love by being present. Others," her eyes flicked toward me, "show it by being busy." My jaw tightened. I said nothing, because arguing would only make me look defensive, emotional, exactly what she wanted. The door to the conference room finally opened, and an assistant stepped out. "Mrs. Carter? Miss Carter, we're ready for you. Sloane stood immediately, smoothing her dress, reclaiming control of the moment. She walked in first, choosing the chair at the head of the table without hesitation. Her family arranged themselves around her like a buffer. I waited until they were seated, then took the lone chair opposite them. The room was heavy with dark wood and old money. Framed certificates lined the walls. A thick legal dictionary sat untouched on a side table. The air conditioning hummed steadily, too cold for comfort. This was where my father's life would be reduced to bullet points and percentages. Miles Bennett hadn't arrived yet. The assistant apologized again for the delay. Mr. Bennett needed to retrieve additional documents related to the estate. Sloane checked her watch with exaggerated irritation. This shouldn't take long, she said. The estate is very straightforward. I noticed something then. Despite her complaints, Sloane looked tense. She adjusted her jewellery repeatedly, smoothed her hair, glanced at the door more than once. She wasn't relaxed. That thought steadied me. When Miles finally entered, the room shifted. He was calm, composed, carrying a leather portfolio that looked well used. His eyes flicked briefly toward me, not with pity, but acknowledgement. "My apologies for the delay," he said. "I wanted to ensure all documents were properly accounted for. This estate is more complex than some of you may realize." Sloane stiffened. "Let's proceed," she said quickly. "There's no need to drag this out." Miles took his seat and opened the portfolio. "Before I begin the formal reading of Graham Carter's will, are there any matters that need to be addressed?" Sloane didn't hesitate. She stood. "I believe there's something important everyone should know before we start," she said, voice smooth, authoritative. "As Graham's wife, I feel it's my responsibility to prepare people for what they're about to hear." Miles frowned slightly, but gestured for her to continue. Sloane reached into her handbag and pulled out a single document. 3 months before his passing, she said, Graham made an amendment to his will. Her eyes locked onto mine. He was deeply hurt by certain people's lack of involvement in his life. After much thought, he decided it was best to reflect that reality. She slid the paper across the table toward Miles. "In this amendment," she continued, "he removed Maya entirely." Her sister gasped. One of the relatives murmured, "That's awful." Sloane's lips curved, just slightly. He felt that someone who couldn't make time for him in life shouldn't benefit from his death. The words felt like a slap. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The room tilted. All the late-night guilt, all the doubt I'd carried for years, surged forward. Was this true? Has my father really done this? I looked at Miles, desperate for something, anything in his face. He picked up the document and studied it carefully. The silence stretched. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I could hear the air conditioning, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. "This appears to be an amendment," Miles said slowly. "Dated February 15th. Sloane's confidence surged. "Exactly. He was very clear about his wishes." My hands clenched in my lap. Then Miles let out a small, unexpected sound. A chuckle. Sloane froze. "Is something amusing?" she asked sharply. Miles laughed again, louder this time, shaking his head as he removed his glasses. "I apologize," he said, wiping his eyes, "but this document is one of the most poorly executed forgeries I've seen in 40 years of practice." The colour drained from Sloane's face. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "That amendment is legal." "Is it?" Miles asked calmly. "Because Graham was hospitalized under heavy sedation on February 15th. I visited him myself." He tapped the page. "This signature doesn't match his. The notary's license expired years ago, and the asset list references properties he sold long before that date." The room erupted in murmurs. Sloane's sister grabbed her arm. The relatives shifted away from her, suddenly fascinated by the wall art. Sloane opened her mouth, then closed it again. Miles straightened the document and set it aside. "Now," he said evenly, "if there are no further interruptions, I'd like to proceed with the reading of the actual will." I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. My father hadn't erased me, which meant he had been planning something else entirely. And whatever it was, Sloane had just walked straight into it. The room went completely still after Miles said that. Not the polite kind of quiet, the kind that presses against your ears until you can hear your own pulse. Sloane didn't sit down. She stood there frozen, one manicured hand still resting on the edge of the table, like she was trying to decide whether to fight or flee. Miles didn't rush. He opened his portfolio again with deliberate calm, as if he were giving everyone time to absorb what had just happened. "Now," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I will read the last will and testament of Graham Carter, signed and properly witnessed 4 months prior to his death." I felt light-headed. My hands were cold. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I prepared myself for disappointment anyway. Years of conditioning don't disappear in a second. Miles began with the legal language. Sound mind, sound body, revoking all previous wills. The words blurred together until he reached the first line that mattered. "To my daughter, Maya Carter." My breath caught. "I leave 70% of my estate." The number hit me like a physical force. 70%. Not a consolation prize, not an apology amount, the majority. Miles continued, listing it out in clean, precise language. Controlling interest in Carter Development Group, the family home, personal property and furnishings, 70% of financial accounts, investments, and insurance policies. I heard a sharp inhale across the table. Sloane's face had gone rigid, her skin flushed a deep, angry red. "That's not possible," she said, her voice tight. "Graham would never do that." Miles didn't look at her. "To my wife, Sloane Carter," he went on, "I leave 30% of my estate, including the Palm Springs property, her personal vehicle, all jewelry acquired during the marriage, and 30% of financial assets." "This is a mistake," Sloane snapped. "He promised me everything." Miles paused, then he turned the page. "I make these distributions with full knowledge of the events that occurred within my marriage and my family relationships," he read. "I have come to believe that my wife systematically attempted to alienate me from my daughter through manipulation, misrepresentation, and intentional interference with our communication." The air left my lungs. For years I had wondered if I was imagining it, if I was dramatic, if I had simply failed as a daughter. My father had seen it, all of it. Miles continued, his voice steady. "I have collected evidence over the past 2 years, including recorded conversations, intercepted communications, and witness statements, documenting these actions." Sloane shook her head violently. "That's a lie. He wasn't in his right mind." "He was," Miles said calmly, "and he was very careful." My vision blurred as tears spilled over. Not the quiet kind I'd perfected over the years, but raw, unstoppable ones. My father knew. He had known, and he had still found a way to protect me. "I chose not to confront my wife," Miles read on, "because I feared she would destroy evidence or further manipulate the narrative. By maintaining the appearance of trust, I was able to preserve proof of her intentions." I pressed my lips together, my shoulders shaking. Then came the line that broke me completely. "To my daughter, Maya, if you are hearing this, please know that I never stopped loving you. Every missed call hurt me more than you can imagine. If you believed I had chosen distance over you, I am deeply sorry. My silence was not indifference, it was a strategy." I covered my mouth with my hand as a sob escaped me. Across the table, Sloane had gone pale. Miles closed the document briefly, letting the weight of the words settle. "There is one final clause," he said. "In the event that my wife attempts to contest this will or present falsified documents, I instruct my attorney to release all collected evidence to the appropriate authorities." Sloane laughed, sharp and brittle. "You're bluffing." Miles reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small USB drive. He anticipated that response. He nodded to his assistant, who connected the drive to the screen on the wall. Sloane's voice filled the room. "Once he's gone, the real will disappears," it said, clear and unmistakable. "I've already prepared a replacement. His daughter won't know until it's too late." Sloane's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Miles stopped the recording. "There are approximately 30 hours of similar material," he he said quietly, along with corroborating emails, witness testimony, and financial records. No one spoke. One by one, Sloane's relatives stood up. Her sister wouldn't meet her eyes. They left without a word, abandoning her just as quickly as they'd rallied around her. Sloane turned to me then, her composure shattered, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she hissed. I stood up slowly, my voice steady in a way it had never been before. "No," I said. "This is where it ends." The room emptied quickly after that. Chairs scraped back, papers were gathered, conversations dropped into uneasy whispers. What had just happened was too big, too ugly to linger around. Sloane stayed seated. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked small. Not powerless, just exposed. Like someone who had spent years controlling the story and suddenly realized the audience had turned. "This changes nothing," she said finally, her voice tight with rage. "I'll contest it. I'll drag this through court until you're begging me to settle." I didn't sit back down. I didn't raise my voice either. "You could," I said, "but you won't." She laughed, sharp and hollow. "You think you scare me?" "No," I said calmly. "I think the evidence does." Miles shifted beside me, opening another folder just enough for her to see the tabs. Derek Holt stepped into the room then, quiet and unassuming, like he hadn't just detonated her entire future by existing. "Your affair," I continued, watching her face carefully. "The shell company, the intercepted messages, the recordings, they don't disappear in probate court. They go public." For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. "I'm offering you a way out," I said. "You take the 30% my father left you, you sign the NDA, you walk away, quietly." "And if I don't?" she asked. "Then everything my father protected you from gets released," I said. "To the courts, to the press, to every charity board you sit on." She stared at me for a long moment, calculating. The woman who thrived on leverage had finally met someone holding more. "This isn't over," she said again, but the threat was weaker now. "It is," I replied. "You just don't like how it ends." She left without another word. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I opened the locked drawer Miles had given me the key to. Inside were letters my father had written to me for years, never sent, never intercepted. Proof that the distance between us had never been real. They thought paperwork could erase me. Paper is exactly what's going to make sure they never try again. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit subscribe. This story isn't really about money. It's about what people do when they think you're too quiet to fight back. Like this video. Share it with someone who's been hurt by family decisions. And tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. I read every story. And if this felt familiar, you're not alone. Sometimes the truth comes late, but it always finds a way out.